Today on the show, we're going to talk about what's going on with the border situation, all of the hysteria that's been stirred up by the media over President Trump upholding and enforcing immigration laws in our country. And now there's all these hysterics about separating families, something that President Trump has put a stop to now with an executive order. But of course, the left is still shouting and screaming and on and on and on. We'll talk about that. We're also going to talk about a lawsuit that has been filed in New Jersey by parents suing the public school district for teaching that Islam is the true faith. Teaching that Islam is the true faith. Now, this is something that's creeping into our system more and more, brethren. We've been talking about Islam on and off for a couple of years now, and probably more about it in the last year than ever before, because things are gaining more and more momentum. Now, thankfully, we have the Trump administration that is not allowing the massive flow of Muslims into our country that the Democrats want to see happen, and that certainly Hillary Clinton wanted to see happen. But President Trump is at least slowing down the whole process, but to a certain extent, it's still going on. To a certain extent, it's still happening. But it's definitely going to be, I think, slowed down by the Trump administration. Let's look at this story here you can find on Jihad Watch. And the headline says, New Jersey parents sue public school district for teaching Islam is the true faith. And then it goes on to say a federal judge has refused to toss out a lawsuit brought by a parent against the Chatham, New Jersey school district, which showed seventh graders a pro-Muslim video that included an invitation to convert to the true faith. In denying the school district's motion to dismiss the case, U.S. District Court Judge Kevin McAnulty said the motion was worth only minimal discussion. And then it goes on to talk about how an attorney with the Thomas More Law Center is representing Libby Hilsenrath, whose 12-year-old son attends the middle school there, and she is apparently the one who has filed the lawsuit. Okay. Now, I remember this story from some months ago. The Thomas More Law Center is a Catholic operation, Catholic outfit. In this regard, however, they could very well be conservative Catholics taking a stand for traditional Christian values from a moral perspective, the traditional morality of our country. And that seems to be the case here. Of course, Thomas More is the, famously known as the man for all seasons. He was a Catholic. He was opposed to the Protestant Reformation. He was opposed to it, but at the same time, he was a very influential figure and is definitely considered a hero in the Catholic Church to this day. So the Thomas More Law Center, if you go to their website at thomasmore.org, it says battle ready to defend America. And you go to their about page, it says of them, quote, the Thomas More Law Center defends and promotes America's Judeo-Christian heritage and moral values, including the religious freedom of Christians, time-honored family values, and the sanctity of human life. It supports a strong national defense and an independent and sovereign United States of America. All right, so that is what they report on their website. And it is this organization, the Thomas More Law Center, that is representing Libby Hilsenrath in this whole Chatham Middle School controversy here against the Islamization of the students. Now, the article goes on to talk about what these students were being taught through these Muslim videos. And it's pretty disturbing. It's very, very disturbing. to think that this has come into America, into the United States. Of course, New Jersey is a notorious blue state. Governor Chris Christie is a conservative guy there, which is, I think, a positive thing. It was certainly a positive thing in the case of Shaneen Allen, the single mom who drove across the border from Pennsylvania and had a gun license. She had a firearm in her vehicle, had a license to carry it from the state of Pennsylvania, but New Jersey says you have to have a license from their state. And if you don't have a license from their state in particular, then you are guilty of a crime. And ultimately, they sentenced Shaneen Allen to 3 years in prison. Governor Christie wrote her a pardon, and so she was released. But nevertheless, that gives you an idea of what kind of a state New Jersey is. Very, very blue state. And this all seems to kind of support what's happening there in the school system. It's hard to imagine anybody would allow this to be taught in the schools. But here's what the article says here, that the lawsuit claims that 7th grade students at the Chatham Middle School were forced to watch a set of videos in their world cultures and geography class that sought to convert them to Islam. Here is a sampling of what the students learned by watching just one of the 5-minute videos. 1. God gave Muhammad the noble Quran. 2. The Quran is a perfect guide for humanity. 3. The Quran is divine revelation. 4. Islam is a shining beacon against the darkness of repression, segregation, intolerance, and racism. And 5. The beautiful Quran is guidance for the wise and sensible. The article says, then came the topper. The video ends with this, quote, may God help us all to find the true faith, Islam. Then it goes on to say a musical version of an Arabic poem plays in the background throughout the video. The lyrics describe Christians and Jews as infidels and praises Muhammad for slaughtering them. Quote, their white shining swords red with the blood of infidels until they looked like meat on the butcher's block. This is the song playing in Arabic to the kids in the school. So it's very important to remember that Islam is not in any way a religion of peace or a peaceable belief system. It is very much a conquering, domineering, controlling, bloody system that says convert or die and feels the need to subjugate and humiliate all non-Muslims, especially Christians and Jews. To humiliate them and to declare that they will be defeated and destroyed, etc. In fact, I talked about the book by Billy Vaughn, whose son was a Navy SEAL who was killed in a helicopter crash with SEAL Team 6, and he wrote his book, Betrayed. Anyway, Billy Vaughn, part of his testimony is that when they had a memorial service for the SEALs, they invited an Afghan minister who came, and you had a traditional memorial service for the Navy SEALs. This happens, and you have a Christian minister who gets up and he gives a traditional speech that you would expect a Christian minister to give on that occasion. Then they have this Afghan Muslim guy get up and he's singing a song in Arabic. And Billy Vaughn and his wife, they captured the lyrics, had them translated, and come to find out what he was singing was the infidel will be destroyed, Islam will win, the Muslims will defeat them, etc. And just all of this, rhetoric against destroying the enemies of Islam. And that's what the guy was singing. And so this is Islam. This is what Islam is about. It's always been about this. This is why Islam has tried to invade the Western world for 1,400 years. And I think, of course, it's a part of the reason why this whole systematic betrayal that's happening from within our country and from within the governments and the deep state of the entire Western world. This is why Billy Vaughn titled his book Betrayed. That's what's really happening. And this is really a betrayal of America. It's a betrayal of what our forefathers fought and died for and what they stood for in this country from the beginning. Our public education system was founded by Christian people for the original purpose of teaching the Bible. Teaching the Bible and teaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. That was the original purpose, going back to the Puritans and the Pilgrims. It began with an old law called the Old Deluder Satan Act. That was the law. And the words of the law began, it being one chief project of that old deluder Satan to keep men from the knowledge of the Scriptures as in former times. I was talking about the Dark Age, back when the Bible was outlawed in the vernacular tongue, and people were not allowed to read it. And so then it goes on to describe the beginnings of what would become public education. But what's the purpose? The purpose was so that children can be taught the Bible. That was the purpose. Now we have these leftists, they're hijacking our country and hijacking the education system, and now they're bringing in not only immorality, I call it Balaamy. They're doing essentially what Balaam instigated in the Old Testament, where he couldn't curse Israel because God turned the curse into a blessing. He couldn't curse Israel, so he gave counsel to their enemies to go send in the immoral women to seduce them into immoral practices, sexual immorality, and then idolatry. Bring in their false gods and corrupt them with immorality and idolatry. And we find the Lord Jesus Christ in the book of Revelation warning about this, warning the church about this over and over and over again. That's why whenever Jesus mentions the doctrines of Balaam, or the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel, etc. And then we essentially hear the same thing from Jezebel, or about Jezebel, that she's teaching the people to commit fornication and to eat things sacrificed to idols, etc. It's the same plan that the devil has used to corrupt the people of God for centuries. Immorality and idolatry. And that's what this is. We know about the immorality. They've been teaching sodomy, homosexuality, transgenderism. They've been corrupting and perverting our children in the schools. And now they're coming in with full-blown idolatry by entering in the moon god of Islam and trying to brainwash our kids into converting and becoming Muslims. And clearly in such a way that they're not just telling you about Islam, but they're clearly exalting, by these presentations, exalting Islam above Christianity. And so this case will be very, very interesting to see how this plays out and where things go from here. All right, Bray, now we want to move on, and we want to talk about the other topic that's all over the news right now. Left-wing media, Hollywood, all of the usual suspects of leftism have come out, and they're shouting and screaming and yelling and everything about the fact that the Trump administration is actually upholding and enforcing the immigration laws in our country, and they're arguing that children are being torn out of the arms of their parents and so on. Time magazine has now done a cover where the cover of Time magazine shows President Trump standing there looking down and a small Mexican child crying in front of him and this kind of thing, as though Trump is persecuting poor children, and on and on and on. Yet in the midst of all of this insanity, they have, and of course it's been rightly pointed out that parents and children are separated all the time every time parents commit a crime. If parents go steal a car or rob a bank or something, and the police find out about it, they're going to go get those people, those adults are going to be arrested, and if they have kids, the kids are going to be taken, and they're going to be put in, either given to other family members or put into foster care or something. But yeah, they will be separated from their parents if their parents commit a crime. Illegal immigration is a crime. It's illegal. You're not supposed to do it. It's a crime. That's how it is. But somehow or other, when parents or children are separated who are Mexican illegals, that somehow or other is not supposed to happen. Now, after all of this shouting and all of these just really horrid comments from the left, including threats against the president's family, against members of the Republican Party, I mean, it's getting really, really ugly out there. It's unbelievable. But the president has signed an executive order putting a stop to the separation of families, keep the families together, but he's resolved to continue defending our border, which most Americans want him to do. The open borders philosophy, brethren, is nothing but pure communism. That's what we have to remember. Open borders is pure communism. And I said this back when Trump first began running for president, and he came out at the beginning and he talked about illegal immigration. And the media kept playing his clip, his video clip, his speech over and over and over again, and they were trashing him, and they thought they were going to completely bump this guy out of the race. Oh, he made these insulting comments against the Mexican illegals. Well, his campaign is over. And they thought they were just going to trash him, and they attempted to. But what happened was it backfired because the American people agree with him. They agree with him. You can't just have people coming here illegally where you don't know who they are. Many of them are criminals. They're drug dealers. They're gang members. They commit hundreds of thousands of crimes, some say millions of crimes in our country. It's unreasonable to expect that there's to be no regulation of these individuals. And of course, there are many, many reports of members of various terror groups coming across the Mexican border because they know it's so easy to get in. Of course, there's nothing illogical, nothing immoral at all about maintaining the sovereignty of our country. Nothing at all. God maintains the sovereignty of heaven. I've talked about this on the program before. Jesus says, I am the door to the sheepfold. By me, men may enter in. But if any man tries to climb in through some other way, the same as a thief and a robber. And no, the Lord does not let people climb in through some other way. They have to go through the way that has been appointed by God. That's part of the lesson of the parable of the wedding feast, where the man shows up without a proper wedding garment. And the king says to him, friend, how did you come here without a proper wedding garment? The man can make no answer, so he's bound hand and foot, and he's cast into outer darkness. He is thrown out. He's deported. That's what happens. He's not just allowed to show up whenever he wants to on his own terms. And that's the whole issue. That's why he's bound hand and foot and cast out. He's deported. Jesus says to seek to enter in through the narrow gate. For many, he says, shall seek to enter and shall not be able. Now think about that. If it were a godly worldview, if God's position on things were the open borders philosophy, if that were godly doctrine, then God would not keep anybody out of heaven. Everybody would be allowed to go to heaven no matter what, whether they obeyed God's rules or not, because that's the issue. America does not keep people out of our country because they're not welcome. They're welcome, but they have to come here on our terms. They have to obey the law. They have to obey the standard of the United States and have legal entry
into the United States of America. The same is true of God and the kingdom of heaven. A person must follow God's standard, God's way that he has prepared, the way that he has established and declared for all mankind for gaining entrance into the kingdom of God. So that's really what's being communicated in John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, so that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. That is the way to enter legally into the kingdom of heaven through the Lord Jesus Christ. And we're told this over and over again throughout the Scripture. Now back to the issues with President Trump. The situation has gotten so bad, you've even got the radical left blaming President Trump for abuses that took place during the Obama administration. And this is posted on InfoWars. An article says, quote, in a renewed focus on detention centers for illegal immigrants, leftists have hit out against President Trump, focusing particularly on a facility in Virginia where it is alleged children were beaten, among other abuses. However, the center opened in 2007, and the alleged abuses were reported in 2016, a year before Trump took office. Okay? So, all of this talk about caring for the children and children separated from their families and so on, all of this has been the standard long before Donald Trump became president of the United States. And so the methods that they're employing are no different than what was employed for 8 years by the Obama administration. But, of course, left-wing media that went around creating all sorts of propaganda for President Obama, they didn't say a word. They didn't say anything. And yet these abuses were going on. Bad things were happening to families and children in these detention centers and so on. But the media never said anything. Now they're trying to exploit it because it is one of the communists' favorite tactics to use children as a political tool of manipulation. But we have to remember these are the same people who drive the abortion industry in our country, where they are killing millions of unborn and partly born children in America. So it seems obvious to many people that they're just simply using this for political rhetoric and propaganda, not really because they care about what happens to the children who are coming into our country illegally. But that's the whole problem. And of course, I think most Americans would agree it's not really the fault of these kids. The situation is unfortunate, but the answer, I think the right answer, is to simply uphold the law, build the border wall, and prevent these kind of situations from happening. But the reason they're happening is much more because of the Democrats and the sanctuary city politicians who are inviting illegals to come into the country. They're encouraging this lawless behavior. That's the problem. All right, brethren, we're going to talk about the advance of Islam in America. The advance of Islam in America. Now, this is a topic that is of increasing importance, brethren, and it's just not going to go away anytime soon, because the powers at work, the globalist powers in our country that want Islam to advance in the United States and the entire Western world, these powers have been working on this project for decades. This is something they are determined to do, to advance not just Islamic culture and ideology, but also political Islam. And that's the real danger. Remember, we've got other groups in our country. We've got people who come here from China, and they form communities called Chinatown in New York, out in L.A., San Francisco. I remember going to the Chinatown, I think it was in L.A., years ago with a friend of mine, and I was there, and you've got Chinese writing everywhere. You've got restaurants and shops and everything, and there's a lot of people there from China who are speaking in Chinese.
And when you turn around in certain parts of it, it's like you are in another country. But nobody ever complains about Chinatown. Nobody's concerned about it. It's a charming aspect of American life, and I think true diversity. I use that word cautiously because it's often used as a weapon by the left. But yes, we do have different cultures in our country. Chinatown, nobody's threatened by Chinatown. The Amish, very similar. The Amish communities, they keep to themselves. They live a very different way of life. And they're riding around in a horse and a buggy. They don't want to ride in a car. They do things differently, but nobody's bothered by them. And the reason is because they don't have a political agenda. Same thing with Chinatown, or at least not one that we really know of. Although we've got some stories here recently about agents on behalf of the Chinese government coming into the United States and spying on our country. We don't deny that, certainly. But the greater body of Chinese people, they're not down at the courthouse trying to change American law every 5 minutes. Same thing with the Amish, and we've got other groups here as well who live peaceably. And they mind their own affairs. They're not trying to hurt anybody. They are pursuing pursuing their dreams within the framework of our Constitution. They're not trying to overturn the Constitution. They're not trying to change American law into something else. That's the difference. And where you have Marxists in our country who are pursuing political ambitions, and Muslims who are also pursuing political ambitions, political Islam, where they want to run for office and they want to be sworn in on a copy of the Quran because they have ambitions where political Islam is concerned. That's the issue. And they've been, as the communists do, as Karl Marx said, history is the battleground. And so one of the stories we're going to talk about today is this article from USA Today that was published here about midway through November, not quite a month ago. And the headline says, "What You Don't Know About America's Islamic Heritage." What you don't know about America's Islamic heritage. And it says, America's Islamic Heritage Museum begins in the 1500s and explores the contributions of American Muslims through the 21st century. Then it goes on, it says, one of the greatest stories rarely told about the long history of Muslim immigration to the United States, stretching back hundreds of years, is actually being told most days by Amir Muhammad, the founder and chief curator of America's Islamic Heritage Museum, a tiny institution with a do-it-yourself collector's vibe, etc. It goes on. You read a little bit further down, and it says, quote, "Did you know there are 2 towns in the United States called Muhammad? There's also a Palestine in Texas and an Aladdin in Wyoming. There's been a U.S. post office in Mecca, Indiana since 1888. In fact, from New Orleans to the Alamo, Moorish styles of architecture can be detected in buildings across the USA. Even the pointed arches that once stood at the base of the fallen World Trade Center towers in New York City mimicked Islamic geometric tradition. Blues music may be a uniquely American art form that originated in the Deep South. Music ethnographers have established that many of its harmonies and note changes resemble Muslim prayers and other recitations, a result of the African slaves who came to the U.S. from Muslim areas on that continent." Oh, so now blues music has its origins in Islam, based on what they're telling us here. Wow. Then it goes on to make this claim, and I think this is very, very important. Experts on Islam say there is a problem with Trump's Muslim narrative. Muslims have been coming to America since at least the 17th century, with anywhere from a third to a quarter of the enslaved Africans brought to the U.S. against their will, likely Muslims. Okay, now what they're doing here is they are turning the Muslims into the victims. But we have to understand something here. They have no way of proving that the slaves who were brought here were Muslims. They have no way of proving this. There are no records, there are no writings, there's none of that. They are making an estimation. And they're also spin doctoring the whole slave narrative. They're not telling anybody that it was the Muslims in Africa who were kidnapping the blacks from the inner parts of Africa and then selling them to the white slavers from America and Great Britain. Okay, that's how it worked. The Muslims typically were not the slaves. Typically, the way the slave trade operated was you had the Muslims in the north, the Moors. They would go into the inner parts of Africa, and they would specifically prey upon these uncolonized, undeveloped African tribes. You've got them there to this day. You just type in uncolonized tribes in Africa, go to Google Images and so on, and just look at the images of all these different tribes. You can see them to this day. These are people walking around in loincloths. Some of them still practice cannibalism. Some of them are still putting bones in their ears and this kind of thing. Very, very primitive. They're not scientifically advanced at all. They have very primitive weapons quite often. And they are easy prey for a more advanced culture like the Moors. Many of the Moors were black. Others among them were Arabs, and there were Berbers. It was kind of a mix. But there's no question they were all Islamic. So the narratives that we're hearing about the slaves being brought to America and this kind of thing, most of the official narratives that I've seen, I mean, you have to go to independent media to learn that the Muslims were the slavers in Africa and that they were key players in the slave trade into America. You go and read the book on Islam by Dr. Peter Hammond. He talks about this. He talks about how when the white slavers arrived, they didn't kidnap blacks. They didn't have to. The blacks had already been subdued. They were already in chains or being kept as slaves by the Islamic slave trade that had been already operating for hundreds of years. So now what they're doing, brethren, is they are trying to bring in, I mean, this is being called all over Europe and throughout the Western world, this is being called the Great Replacement, where they are trying to bring in Islam to literally replace Christianity. Quite literally, that is what they're doing. And I talk about this in our audio CD, Hitler's Jihad, that this is something that I believe goes back to World War II. And Hitler and other Nazis, their desire to have Islam replace Christianity. All right, but let's remind ourselves of what we read in 2 Kings, because what are they doing? They're trying to bring in another god into our country. They're trying to set up their idol in America, the moon god, and they're trying to get we as Americans to bow and to submit to their pagan idol. This is what's going on. Now, here is what we read in the Old Testament in 2 Kings chapter 17. And in verse 35, talking about the children of Israel, it says, with whom the Lord had made a covenant and charged them, saying, ye shall not fear other gods, nor bow yourselves to them, nor serve them, nor sacrifice to them. But the Lord, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, with great power and a stretched out arm, him shall ye fear, and him shall ye worship, and to him shall ye do sacrifice. And the statutes and the ordinances and the law and the commandment which he wrote for you, ye shall observe to do forevermore. and ye shall not fear other gods. And the covenant that I have made with you, ye shall not forget, neither shall ye fear other gods. Notice over and over and over again, the Lord is declaring here through the scripture, telling the children of Israel, his people, ye shall not fear other gods. In other words, don't allow foreign gods to tell you what to do. And then in verse 39, we read, but the Lord your God ye shall fear, and he shall deliver you out of the hand of all your enemies. So that is God's promise. I've said it over and over again on this program because I think it's so important. What's happening in our country, brethren, through these socialists and their jihadi allies, their Sharia law promoting allies, what they want to do is set up two false gods in our country, Karl Marx on one hand and Allah, the moon god, on the other, and they are trying to get us, the American people, and Christians in this country, who are still the majority here in the United States, trying to get us to bow to these other gods, to fear these other gods, and to make our laws and our decisions, etc., based on what these false gods want us to do. But we have to remember, we have to remind ourselves and each other, the Lord says over and over and over again, ye shall not fear other gods. Don't allow them to direct you. Don't allow them to tell you, you have to do this, you can't do that, etc. We're called to fear the Lord and to keep his commandments and to trust in him that he will deliver us from the hands of all our enemies. All right, talking about the advance of Islam in America. Now, before we went to the break, we were talking about this USA Today story on the Islamic Museum of America, or America's Islamic Heritage Museum, where what they're trying to do, following the Marxist tactic of rewriting history, is they are trying to build a narrative of Islam in America going back to the very beginning, to try and argue that Islam really is part of the foundation of America and has been here from the beginning. And you know what? These Muslims were brought here forcibly by their white Christian slave masters, and it's not their fault, and so you can't keep them out of America. Now, this is the idea. I mean, this seems to be entirely the direction that they're going in with the whole argument. And of course, we know that Barack Obama, while he was president, he made all of these outlandish statements about Islam being interwoven in the fabric of America and all this other kind of stuff. They are inventing this narrative because they want to argue that Muslims have been here from the beginning and that they have a right to the country, okay, and they have a right to advance not just to be here, but really to advance Islam in our country. Again, the real danger is political Islam. That's the direction they're headed with all of this. And they are, they've gotten people elected to office now. We've got the two Muslim congresswomen that have been elected. Keith Ellison was the first Muslim elected to Congress. Now we have things like we've got this case where an activist judge has now ruled in Michigan that the federal law against female genital mutilation, which is basically female castration, which is a common practice in Islam. There's a lot of young girls who suffer, end up in the hospital and all this other kind of stuff because of this gruesome procedure that is carried out in Islamic culture of castrating young girls, because the Islamic worldview is if you castrate them, then they are more likely to be faithful to their husbands when they grow up and get married, that they'll just be there for their husband and not anyone else. That's the idea. That's not my interpretation of things. You can go study this. That's why they do it. And so Now they've been carrying on this practice. The Islamic doctors, some of them, have been doing it secretly. And of course, they can do it secretly, even though it's against the law, because they believe Sharia and Islam is higher than any other law. It doesn't matter. They don't have to obey our laws. They can obey their laws because that's what Islam teaches them to do. So now a case went to court in Michigan where you had a doctor, Jumana Nagarwala, who was accused of mutilating the genitals of multiple girls when they were about 7 years old, 7-year-old girls. Now, a federal judge in Michigan has dropped most of the charges against the Detroit doctor accused of female genital mutilation, concluding that Congress, quote, overstepped its bounds when it passed a law banning the practice. And this is how they're going to advance, I believe, this is how they're going to advance Sharia law in the United States. This is how they're going to do it. They're going to do it through judicial activism, through the courts, just like they have brought in every other subversive doctrine from abortion to gay marriage to illegal immigration. They protect the illegals through judicial activism, etc., etc. Name a subversive doctrine that you're upset about in our country, and you can trace it almost always to judicial activism. Unelected lawyers and judges manipulating the law and the Constitution through our courts. It happens over and over and over and over again. This allows them to override the American people, Congress, everything else. It's a lot easier to convince one lawyer and one judge to make a decision than it is to get 300 million people to vote for representatives that will go into Congress and make laws. And so their way of getting around all of that has been since the end of World War II. The way to get around all of that is just get one or two lawyers, get them into a court, go stand in front of one federal judge, make an argument, federal judge bangs the gavel, bam, that changes the Constitution. They've done this over and over and over and over again. This is the tactic. And if Americans, if patriots in our country, if Christians and patriots don't figure out a way to shut down judicial activism, there's virtually nothing that they can't legalize. They'll be able to legalize based on these methods. They could set up gulags and concentration camps in our country and argue that it's unconstitutional to oppose them. And the reason it's so dangerous to have this happening through the courts is because the courts in our country have become, I'll say, they have become notoriously anti-Christian and anti-American. Only under President Trump have we seen resistance, for example, to the homosexual persecution of Christians in our country, where they're trying to bankrupt Christians because they won't provide gay wedding services somewhere, and trying to see if they can put them out of business and destroy them. And what they're waiting for now is to get another left-wing president in the White House who will support these efforts. And with it, they're going to try and advance persecution of Christians and patriots, etc., and conservatives in our country who speak out against Islam. This is already happening all over Europe. They have already outlawed speaking against the Prophet Muhammad in public. They've already outlawed this. In Egypt, there's a story on Jihad Watch. Yeah, Christian gets 3 years prison for insulting Islam. 3 years in prison in Egypt. Egypt, a country that was governed by Christianity for over 600 years. Now you have a story from Laura Loomer, which you can also find on the Geller Report. And the headline is that Google approves app for Muslims to report people who commit blasphemy. Apparently that is in Indonesia where that's happening. But these things are happening, and we know that the tech giants, Facebook, Google, Twitter, all of these guys, they are very left-leaning. They are globalists. They're in the tank for globalism, and they have a very hostile anti-Christian worldview. and they're trying to advance Islam. And if something happens, if Donald Trump, if and when he leaves the White House, we know he can only be there one more term after this. But if we end up with a left-wing president, another Obama or somebody like Hillary in the White House, I think there's no question they're going to try to advance Sharia and try to find ways to punish people who speak against Islam. The Democrats have already tried to do this. They tried to do it. They tried to pass legislation back in 2015. H.R. 569, House Resolution 569, that said in part condemning violence, bigotry, and hateful rhetoric towards Muslims in the United States. What they call hate speech, use any kind of so-called hateful rhetoric against Islam, which quite often they interpret hateful rhetoric as if you document facts and information about Islam, that is considered hateful. All right, brethren. So that is our current update. I was going to get to the jihad report. According to the Religion of Peace, according to the religionofpeace.com, there were 136 jihad attacks in November of 2018 and 911 people killed by jihadis in some 25 countries around the world. That is the latest jihad report from the religionofpeace.com. All right, we are out of time. Today on the show, we are going to talk about Bosnia and the war in Bosnia back in the 1990s. Bosnia, which has been called the cradle of modern jihad. We are going to talk about Bosnia as what I think could be called the cradle of modern Islamophobia because of what happened at a place called Srebrenica. One of the most important stories from the 20th century, the echoes of which continue into the 21st century and right into modern times. That's going to make more sense by the time we get to the end of this program. But the place is probably not terribly familiar to most people listening to our program. It was, and it has continued to be, a topic of great controversy since the time of the Bosnian War back in the 1990s during the Clinton administration. But the elements of it, what was supposedly said to have happened there was this horrible genocide, they say, of Muslims, where the Serbian Christians supposedly came in and mass murdered all of these Muslim men and boys, thousands of them, 8,000 of them, they say. And they have this big memorial, and they talk about it. If you go online and you look this up, Srebrenica, it's spelled like Srebrenica, Srebrenica. That's the spelling. The CA is supposed to be almost like a ZA, almost like bonanza. Srebrenica. All right, so anyway, so the story, why it's important, is that this happened back in the 1990s. And it was said to be this horrible massacre that was the worst thing to have happened since the Holocaust during World War II. And that's the way it was presented to the American people and really to the Western world. Apparently, Bill Clinton and the Clinton administration played a big role in this, working with Muslims. Bill Clinton sided with the Muslims against the Serbian Christians during that time. Now, to understand what was going on, well, I'm going to read part of this review here. If you go look up Srebrenica, most of the websites that talk about it, most of them will tell you that there was this horrible genocide of Muslims killed by the Serbs. What they don't tell you is that before this battle happened, that what happened was these Muslims were jihadis, and the Muslims had gone around to these Serbian Christian villages, and they had massacred thousands of Serbian Christians who were ordinary civilians. They had raped, they had disemboweled, they had beheaded people, they had burned them, they had committed all of these atrocities, very similar to what ISIS is on record for doing, and other Islamic groups, okay, jihadi groups. So they committed these atrocities against the Serbian Christians, and then when the Serbian authorities found out about it, they raised up their military force, went after these guys, ultimately pinned them down at Srebrenica and slaughtered them. And apparently slaughtered really about 2,000 of them. And then in the aftermath, Bill Clinton, it is said, and the Muslims portrayed this whole thing as though it were a genocide. What they did was they covered up the fact that these were jihadis who had mass murdered a bunch of Christians. They covered that up and then just focused on the killing of the Muslims and made it out like these Muslims were innocent victims of horrible, Christian anti-Muslim bigotry. That's why I say that in many ways, once you understand what happened here, this is like the cradle of so-called Islamophobia, portraying the Muslims as innocent victims when in fact they're the aggressors and the murderers, but portraying them as though they're innocent victims and blaming the Christians as though Christians are horrible, bigoted racists who are persecuting the innocent Muslims. This is basically the symbolism of Srebrenica. And the reason I believe this is important, and just so you know, brethren, if you begin to look into this whole controversy, there's no doubt you have two stories here. You have the mainstream media version of what happened, which is the Serbian Christian forces went in there and killed thousands of innocent Muslim men and boys. That's one version. Then you have the Serbian version, which is, no, that's not what happened at all. These Muslims were jihadis. They were murdering innocent men, women, and children in gruesome slaughters. I mean, they have photographs of what the Muslims did to the Christians. You can find them online. They are very disturbing, and in keeping with all of the descriptions of the atrocities committed by Muslims in many different parts of the world that we have seen more and more since the 9/11 attacks here in America. The exact same kind of atrocities. But remember, Srebrenica happened years before 9/11. This happened back in the 1990s during the Clinton administration. And the pattern of what they did, apparently what mainstream media did, is cover up the atrocities of the Muslims, put the blame on the Christians, the Serbians in particular. Blame the Serbian Christians. The Muslims, of course, are made out to be innocent, as though they didn't do any harm. And you see really the groundwork, or what I see as the groundwork, of the propaganda that has since taken off and just become more and more normalized in the West, where Western media is this pro-Islamic propaganda system that continually slants and spins stories against the interests of Christianity and the free world and in favor of Islam and the globalist intent. In fact, if you study the work of the Swiss journalist Alexander Doran, and I'm going to read some quotes here from him. Alexander Doran, who has gotten himself into some trouble over his reporting on all of this several years ago, back in 2015. But he spent 14 years researching all of this and published a book on Srebrenica. And here, let me read from this article by him. The headline is Srebrenica, Neither Massacre Nor Genocide. And he says, quote, after 14 years of investigating events that took place in Srebrenica in 1995, I can attest there was no genocide over Muslims in that enclave. The myth about the massacre of Muslims was invented by the late Bosnian Muslim war leader Alija Izetbegovic and then U.S. President Bill Clinton. So this was something that, and I've read from multiple sources, they say Bill Clinton was directly involved in creating this myth of a so-called genocide against the Muslims. And so this is according to Swiss researcher Alexander Doran. author of the book Srebrenica, The History of Salon Racism. That's the title. It actually has a German title, but the English translation is Srebrenica, The History of Salon Racism, as he told Belgrade Daily Press in an exclusive interview. He added that contrary to the popular mythology still dominating Western mainstream media, Muslims who lost their lives in Srebrenica were grown men rather than boys, and had been gunned down while fighting against the Bosnian Serb army, which, as he points out, can in no way be equated with a massacre, let alone genocide. Now, what's interesting about this is the reason why I find this story very interesting, because you definitely have two versions of events that are being told, but there is a pattern that has emerged over the last 20 years, let's say. And that pattern is, notice that Muslim men are being referred to as boys, as though they're underage. This we're finding over and over again with this massive immigration into the Western world. Muslim men are often being defined as children just so that they can get them into these countries as refugees. Okay? And they're being called children, and then these stories happen where they end up doing harm to somebody, and then you come to find out, well, how did they get in the country? Well, they came in as a child, as a minor, supposedly, but they weren't a minor at all. They were a grown man in their 20s and should never have been admitted as a child refugee. So this is a pattern. And just as we're seeing them do today, apparently they did the same thing back with what happened in Srebrenica, defining Muslim men as boys to try and make them appear to be victims rather than aggressors and predators. Rather than that. But if you go study the atrocities that they committed against the Serbian Christians, it's really unbelievable. Very, very disturbing. And the images that you can find, even though it's the images that you find online of what they did are very disturbing, not for the faint of heart. I do not recommend, if you're disturbed by this kind of thing, and I think anybody's going to be disturbed by it, but if you're excessively disturbed, I wouldn't go look at them. But it's very troubling. And to remember now, these are Christians. This is the reason why I think this is so important to the Christian world, because this is the pattern. The Christians are victimized, they're raped, they're murdered, they're demoralized by the Muslim jihadis, and then the whole thing is spin-doctored to make it look like it's the Christians' fault, if the Christians defend themselves against these atrocities. This is the outrage, and it's this pattern that has continued right up to this day. The Jesuits at Georgetown, as we've said, what are they doing? They're portraying basically all Americans and Westerners, Christians, as Islamophobic, as irrational, as bigots and racists and this kind of thing, and that they have no legitimate reason for being concerned about Islam. And they should just let Muslims flood into the country without any sort of restraints whatsoever. That is the reason. And we see where they're going with this. Islamophobia, as we've said before, is the doorway for Sharia law. By making the claim that Muslims are being endangered by the bigoted Christians in the West, then the very next thing that the socialists do is they say, well, we need to come up with laws that will punish anybody who speaks out against Islam and is guilty of so-called Islamophobia. This is what they've been doing up in Canada. They're developing those laws. They've already got laws in Western Europe. Now, if you publicly insult Muhammad or Islam, you can be punished in Western Europe. This is what they have developed. And the Democrats, as we've talked about before, they tried to develop this back in 2015 here in the United States with H.R. 569, House Resolution 569, with the 114th Congress the purpose of which was, quote, condemning violence, bigotry, and hateful rhetoric towards Muslims in the United States. Look that up, brethren. H.R. 569, 114th Congress, 2015 to 2016. And that is why, ultimately, all of these things matter. Okay, let's go to our day. Today, we are talking about, well, we began talking about Srebrenica and what happened there. We're going to transition now and talk a little bit more about what is going on in the United States. Here in just a minute, I'm going to read some quotes. This is from Dr. Bill Warner, or I'm going to read quotes from Dr. Bill Warner, and his comments about Rashida Tlaib being sworn in on a copy of the Quran. Now, Rashida Tlaib, she is one of the two new Muslim congresswomen that were sworn in. She's the Palestinian that has been talking and bragging and boasting about impeaching President Trump, which we really do not think is going to happen. Nevertheless, Dr. Warner believes that her being sworn in on a copy of the Quran was, in fact, an act of sedition. An act of sedition for this to happen, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. But before that, I want to read the headline here. This is from the website voiceofeurope.com, and they've got an article, the headline of which is, quote, with 100 Sharia courts and 423 new mosques, London is more Islamic than many Muslim countries. London is more Islamic than many Muslim countries. That is very disturbing, that there would be 423 mosques in London. I mean, I'm still wondering if that's accurate. But according to this article, it says mosques are popping up all over Britain, especially in its capital city of London. Sharia courts are in full function in London, handing out actual decisions to London's ever-growing Muslim population. Quote, London is more Islamic than many Muslim countries put together, Islamic preacher Maulana Syed Raza Rizvi told local media. Churches still outnumber mosques in Britain, but there are many mosques that are becoming overcrowded. And then it says the Daily Mail, 5 years ago, the Daily Mail published photos of churches and mosques in London. The difference was astonishing. The St. Mary's Church had only 12 people attending Mass, while nearby at the Brune Street Estate Mosque, there were over 100 Muslims full to capacity. Then it goes on to say that since 2001, some 500 London churches had been turned into private homes. 500, think about that. 500 London churches turned into private homes. So you've got Christian churches being virtually abandoned based on this reporting. And just so we understand, this reporting, the reason I'm reading this is because this is consistent with what I have been told from friends of mine who are living over in London and who have been there for many years. This is not an inconsistent report. The Christianity in England is in real trouble. It's in real trouble. And right now, the leadership that is stepping up to the plate to try and fight against this, while they are, the approach that they're taking is more of a populist approach rather than a biblical approach. They are relying upon populism. And I'm very concerned about populism as the solution to globalism and socialism and Sharia. And the reason is because I don't think populism is really going to be the answer, because it's not what delivered our forefathers in the past. Our forefathers were delivered by returning to the Bible and returning to the commandments of God. And while there is some mention of that, there's some mention of our Christian heritage among the populists, I'm still I still think about Cromwell, the Puritans. I think about the boldness of many of our revolutionary forefathers during the American Revolution. I think about the boldness of Samuel Adams, where Christianity is concerned, and political Protestantism, etc. And there was very clearly an appeal to heaven and to God, and God was very clearly the God of the Bible, not someone else. Now what you have is you have these Muslims who were sworn into Congress, and there was talk at first that Rashida Tlaib, who's the Palestinian Muslim, was going to be sworn in on a copy of Thomas Jefferson's Bible. Thomas Jefferson's Koran. Thomas Jefferson's copy of the Koran. That's what was given out. That's what was reported. And this is what Dr. Bill Warner responded to initially. However, she changed her mind and chose to be sworn in only on a copy of the family Koran. That's what happened. She also said, and this is according to the BBC, they quoted her, she said, quote, "It's important to me because a lot of Americans have this kind of feeling that Islam is somehow foreign to American history," she said. Quote, "Muslims were there at the beginning. Some of our founding fathers knew more about Islam than some members of Congress now." Of course, she doesn't talk about what it was that they knew about Islam, that it was a warmongering belief system, and this is partly what Dr. Warner points out. So he considers her being sworn in on a copy of the Quran to be an act of sedition. So he addressed the idea of Jefferson's Quran, and he says, quote, "It is not Jefferson's Quran, it is Muhammad's Quran." And then he says, Jefferson owned a Quran to understand and defeat the Islamic Barbary pirates. How many members of Congress have read the Quran and Sunnah from cover to cover or have any idea what is written on these pages? And then he says, we have evidence of our forefathers' reference to the Quran, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson to John Jay, March 28, 1786. And this is actually the very well-known letter when Jefferson and Adams are confronting the ambassador from Tripoli, who was a Muslim, and he's representing the Islamic interest there. Why? Because the Muslims were hijacking our ships and enslaving our sailors, our crew. And basically, Jefferson and Adams said, by what right, that they made war upon a nation who had done them no injury, and that they'd given no provocation. And they said, quote, "The ambassador answered us that it was founded on the laws of their prophet, that it was written in their Koran that all nations who should not have acknowledged their authority were sinners, that it was their right and duty to make war upon them wherever they could be found, and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners, and that every Mussulman or Muslim who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise." Okay? That is what Jefferson and Adams reported in a letter to John Jay back during the Barbary Wars. That was their knowledge of Islam. And so notice that they said that it was written in their Quran. It was written in their Quran that they could do these things, that they could enslave everybody and whatnot. And so here is what Dr. Warner says. He says, Tlaib is swearing her oath on a Quran that says that Muslims are superior to all and the non-Muslim kafir is lower than animals. It also says that a Muslim is not the friend of a kafir. And he says Tlaib is swearing her oath on a book that declares our U.S. Constitution is not the highest law in the land. In short, Rashida Tlaib, by swearing her oath on a Quran, commits an act of sedition. Dr. Bill Warner, and we would generally agree with him. All right, brethren, we are out of time. That is going to do it for us today. That is our show. We'll stop it there.